Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Ready to explore some fascinating new insights with me?
Always.
Awesome. Today we're diving deep into, you guessed it, nature. Specifically how nature and business intersect. All laid out in this compelling new Citi GPS report called Nature, Sustainability's Next Frontier. It's packed with thought-provoking analysis, really gets you thinking about the big picture.
It does paint a pretty stark picture, especially at the beginning. No sugarcoating the urgency of the situation.
So true, and that's where we're starting today. What's the state of our planet's natural health? The report doesn't shy away from some pretty alarming statistics.
Well, they use something called the Biodiversity Intactness Index, or BII, to assess things.
Right, the BII. So what does that tell us?
Basically, a healthy ecosystem needs a BII of at least 90% to be resilient. Globally, we're sitting at about 75%, which is a big red flag. It means we've seen a significant decline in biodiversity.
Wow, 75%. That's a real wake-up call. It reminds me of our deep dive on the UN's Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, where we talked about similar concerns. But let's talk about the economic side of things. What are the implications of this decline, especially for businesses?
It's huge. The decline in what we call natural capital poses a really substantial threat to the global economy.
Meaning?
Well, the World Bank estimates that if these ecosystems continue to deteriorate at this rate, we could see a drop in global GDP, something like 2.3% by 2030.
2.3% of global GDP? That's massive.
It is, and it would mean big financial losses for any industries that rely on natural resources, which, let's be honest, is a lot of them. And that triggers a ripple effect through the entire global economy.
It's like dominoes. One thing affects everything else.
Yeah.
It makes you realize that environmental issues are economic issues, too. Now, the report digs deep into how various industries are both impacting and depending on nature. It really highlights this complex relationship, almost like a dance, between business and the environment. What were some of the things that jumped out at you in their analysis?
Well, the sheer range of industries affected is pretty striking.
In what way?
I mean, we often think of sectors like agriculture, mining, those obvious ones, as being connected to nature. But this report shows just how dependent so many other sectors are on nature. Even things like arts and recreation rely heavily on what we call ecosystem services.
That's not something most people would think about, the arts relying on nature. Could you give us a specific example of how, say, a decline in nature actually translates to real-world business risk?
Sure. Imagine a company that makes beverages, right? Their production depends on having a reliable source of fresh water.
Makes sense.
Now, let's say water stress increases in the region where they operate. Could be from climate change, ecosystem degradation, you name it. Suddenly, they're facing serious risks. Production could be halted, costs for sourcing water skyrocket, and then there's the reputational damage.
Consumers might see them as part of the problem.
Exactly. And that can hit their bottom line hard.
It's a chain reaction. And speaking of location, the report really emphasizes that location matters. Why is that geographic aspect so critical when we're evaluating these nature-related impacts and dependencies?
Well, because nature isn't uniform. What affects one place might not affect another in the same way. A global assessment gives a general overview, but the specific impacts and dependencies are going to vary depending on where a business is operating.
So a global average doesn't tell the whole story.
Right, and that's where the report's geospatial analysis comes in.
Geospatial analysis sounds complicated.
It's actually really interesting. It pinpoints potential conflict zones, places where industrial facilities and ecologically sensitive areas overlap.
So they're basically looking for those pressure points where business interests and the environment could clash.
Exactly. They layer data on things like industrial facilities, biodiversity hotspots, water stress, all on the same map, and it lets you see those areas where interests might collide.
So if a company is operating in a place with high biodiversity A&D, high water stress, they really need to pay attention.
Definitely. The stakes are much higher in those kinds of sensitive locations. And the report takes it even further. It breaks down the analysis by industry.
To show.
Which sectors have the most facilities in those high-risk zones? For example, a quarter of coal mining facilities, which use a ton of water, are in areas with high or extreme water stress.
25%, that's a big chunk.
It is, and it really highlights how important it is for businesses to think about location when assessing nature-related risks. It's not just about the overall impact, it's about understanding where those impacts are most concentrated and have the potential to do the most damage.
Makes sense. Now, businesses aren't just sitting back and watching all this unfold, are they? They need to navigate this evolving world of regulations and frameworks, right? What's the current state of how we govern and manage nature?
It's a fast-moving landscape, that's for sure.
Yeah.
There's been a surge in international agreements and frameworks trying to tackle this issue of nature loss head-on.
What are some of the key ones?
Well, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or GBF, adopted in 2022, is a big one. It sets some ambitious targets for halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030, with the ultimate goal of living in harmony with nature by 2050.
Harmony by 2050, that's a lovely thought.
It is. It's a call to action for everyone, including businesses.
So it's not just about governments setting policies, but about companies actually changing the way they operate.
Exactly. And the GBF isn't alone. We also have the UN High Seas Treaty, agreed upon last year, which is a big step towards protecting those vast areas of the ocean. Plus, there's a UN treaty in the works to combat plastic pollution. It's clear that there's growing recognition of how important nature is and that we need to work together to protect it.
These are big global agreements, but how do they trickle down to the everyday actions of businesses? What specific regulations or frameworks should companies really be paying attention to?
There are several emerging, and the EU is taking the lead in mandating certain disclosures. One key regulation is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD.
The CSRD, right.
It went into effect at the start of this year, and it requires companies to report on how sustainability issues, including nature loss, could pose financial risks to their business. They also have to detail their impact on society and the environment. It's really pushing for transparency and accountability.
Sounds like a game changer. And how many companies does this apply to?
It's estimated that around 50,000 companies worldwide fall under the scope of the CSRD. That tells you how much nature is becoming a mainstream business concern. The report also mentions another important EU directive, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD.
The CSDDD, right, that aims to standardize how companies assess and mitigate environmental and social risks, including those related to nature, and not just in their own operations, but in their supply chains as well.
Precisely. It's about taking responsibility for the actions of your partners, too. And then there's the EU Deforestation Regulation, or EUDR, which came into force last June and applies starting December 2024. It's focused on companies that place or export products linked to deforestation in or from the EU market.
So things like palm oil, soy, timber, those kinds of commodities.
Exactly. Those companies have to assess and mitigate their risks, gather information, and report on their due diligence efforts.
Seems like the EU is setting a precedent. Could we see similar regulations popping up in other regions?
Definitely a possibility. In fact, the report points to China's new sustainability reporting guidelines, which went into effect in May. They require mandatory disclosure on various sustainability issues, including biodiversity, from any company listed on their 3 biggest stock exchanges. So that's another major market pushing for transparency.
So we've got these international agreements setting the stage and regional regulations getting more specific. What about frameworks that can help businesses actually implement all these changes? What guidance is out there?
There are quite a few frameworks offering advice on things like disclosure, setting targets, and assessing impact. One of the most prominent is the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD. It's modeled after the Taskforce on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, which has become a global standard for reporting on climate.
Right, the TCFD. So the TNFD is aiming to do the same for nature.
Exactly. It provides businesses with a standardized method for disclosing their nature-related risks and opportunities. It's about creating a common language and promoting transparency.
And is it gaining traction?
Oh yeah, just like we saw with the TCFD, over 400 organizations are already aligned with the framework. They're committed to disclosing their nature-related issues based on its recommendations. It's becoming quite influential.
That's impressive, 400 organizations. So beyond disclosure, what other key frameworks are mentioned in the report?
Well, there's the Science-Based Targets Network, or SBTN, which focuses on target setting. It builds on the existing Science-Based Targets Initiative for Climate, but provides specific guidance for setting targets related to nature.
So just like companies set science-based targets to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, they can use the SBTN to set targets for minimizing their impact on things like water, land, and biodiversity.
Exactly. And for measuring and accounting for impact on nature, there are frameworks like the Natural Capital Protocol, the Transparent and Aligned Projects, and the Biodiversity Protocol. They all provide standardized methods for companies to measure and assess their impact.
So companies have a roadmap, frameworks to guide them, and increasing pressure to act. But to actually manage their impact, they need data. What are some of the challenges and opportunities presented by nature data?
The report actually pushes back on the idea that there's a shortage of nature data. The truth is, a ton of data exists, from open source providers to those specializing in Earth observation. The real challenge lies in accessing it, understanding it, and figuring out how to use it.
So it's not about a lack of data, it's about making sense of what we already have.
Exactly. It can be scattered in different formats, maybe not covering all aspects of nature equally. It's hard for businesses to get a clear, comprehensive picture of their impact. And historically, nature data has had some limitations in coverage, historical data, and data from those hard-to-reach remote locations, which is often where businesses operate. That's why we've seen an increase in using data from Earth observation and satellites.
Satellites, like
Yeah.
having eyes in the sky.
Right. They can track things like deforestation, monitor water quality, map biodiversity hotspots. It's a powerful tool for understanding the state of nature and a company's impact.
A real game changer. But you said the nature data ecosystem is developing rapidly. What's making it more user-friendly for businesses?
We're seeing major ESG data providers like Bloomberg and S&P Global enter the scene. They're combining different data sets and approaches to offer more comprehensive insights.
So they're basically making it easier for companies to get the information they need in a format they can use.
Exactly. And then there are also some really cool innovations happening with in situ observations and using AI to analyze satellite imagery. For example, companies like Naturemetrics are using environmental DNA, or eDNA, to monitor biodiversity.
eDNA, that's fascinating.
Yeah, instead of trying to capture and identify every single species, they analyze traces of DNA in the environment. It's a much more efficient way to get a snapshot of biodiversity.
So no more chasing butterflies with nets.
Well, maybe sometimes, but this is definitely a huge step forward. And then there's ecoacoustics, which uses sound recordings to monitor different species. It's a non-invasive way to track biodiversity without disturbing the environment.
So we're using technology to listen to nature. That's incredible.
Yeah.
What are some key takeaways for companies trying to navigate this complex world of nature data?
The report has some great advice. First, focus on the facilities that are most likely to have a big impact on nature. For investors like you, that might mean starting with an analysis of different sectors or industries to identify those areas with the highest potential risk.
Start with the big picture, then zoom in.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to reach out to the experts. There are NGOs, academic institutions, people who have been working on this for years. They're often happy to share their knowledge and offer guidance.
Collaboration is key.
Absolutely. And finally, embrace those satellite images and geospatial analytics. If you want to accurately measure impact and risk, you need to assess things at the facility level, and satellite data is essential for that.
It's like having a bird's eye view of a business's impact across entire landscapes. Now, the report also features interviews with some real experts within this nature data ecosystem. Let's hear what they have to say.
Definitely. The report includes interviews with Dr. Genevieve Patenaude, the CEO of EarthBlocks, an Earth observation and geospatial analytics firm, and Alex Logan, the co-founder and CEO of Cecil Earth, a nature data platform. They offer some really valuable insights into the power and potential of nature data.
Let's start with Dr. Patenaude. She talks about how satellite imagery can provide both situational awareness and trend mapping for businesses.
Right. She explains how satellite imagery can offer historical insights into deforestation, habitat loss, and pollution monitoring. It can help with water resource management and even track events like oil spills and wildfires.
That's a pretty wide range of applications. But are there any limitations to satellite imagery that businesses should be aware of?
Dr. Patenaude does point out that things like cloud cover, nighttime, and the darkness of winter can affect the quality and availability of the imagery. Since images from these camera-like sensors rely on sunlight, it can sometimes take longer to get the data you need.
So knowing those limitations is important. But she also mentions that radar satellites are helping to fill those gaps.
Exactly. Radar satellites can see in the dark and through clouds, which means they can provide data even in those challenging conditions.
So we're always finding ways to overcome those hurdles. Dr. Patenaude also talks about using satellite imagery to support nature reporting, specifically within that TNFD framework we talked about earlier.
She explains how satellite imagery can help us get metrics like ecosystem primary productivity, changes in land cover, or even things like surface topography and slope. Combined with other data sets, these metrics can help assess a company's dependence on those ecosystem services.
So it goes beyond just providing a snapshot of nature. It can actually help businesses understand their reliance on healthy ecosystems.
Right. It's a big step towards quantifying nature-related risks and dependencies. And Dr. Patnode really stresses how important cloud computing is for processing and analyzing all this data at scale. Tools like Earthblocks can do these calculations for thousands, even millions, of company assets.
So we can assess impact across a much wider footprint. That's pretty amazing. What does Dr. Patnode see for the future of nature data?
She predicts a big increase in how often data is collected, along with improvements in data quality, thanks to advancements in both ground-based tools and satellite technology. She also thinks AI will be crucial in making sense of all that data.
So AI won't just be collecting the data, it will also help us interpret it, find patterns, and understand those complex interactions happening within nature.
Exactly. She calls it moving from just sensing to sense-making.
I like that sense-making.
Yeah.
Now, let's shift to Alex Logan from Cecil Earth. He identifies 3 fundamental challenges with nature data that his company is trying to tackle. What are those challenges?
First, there are just so many data sets available. It can be really overwhelming for businesses to figure out which ones are right for them, especially since those data sets aren't always well documented.
Like having too many choices, you're paralyzed by the options.
Exactly. The second challenge is actually integrating and preparing those data sets for analysis. Each data set might have a different format, different units of measurement, different spatial resolutions, and even different usage rights. Trying to combine data from multiple sources to get that unified view can be a huge headache.
Sounds like a logistical nightmare. What's the third challenge?
Navigating all those commercial agreements and usage rights. Each data provider might have different business models, minimum spend requirements, or restrictions on how you can use their data. For smaller businesses, this can make it really expensive or logistically challenging to even access the data they need.
So, there are real barriers to entry. How is Cecil Earth tackling these challenges?
They've created a platform that curates, standardizes, and makes nature data accessible for businesses. They handle the data integration, make sure it's usable, and simplify the whole process of understanding and complying with usage rights.
So they're basically a one-stop shop for nature data. That's pretty cool. Who are they targeting with this platform?
Their main target audience is data scientists, data analysts, and science teams who need accurate site-level nature data for their work. That could be nature tech startups, asset managers, project developers, you name it.
Anyone who needs to make decisions based on solid data about nature. Does he see that user base changing in the future?
He thinks demand for nature data is going to skyrocket as businesses face more pressure to manage their risks, comply with regulations, and meet their sustainability goals. He specifically mentions corporations with a lot of exposure to natural assets, like those in forestry, materials, and food and beverage. They're going to become increasingly reliant on this type of data.
Makes sense. Those are the industries really feeling the impact of nature loss. And of course, any financial institutions investing in those companies will need data too.
Absolutely. He also sees more specialization happening within the nature tech space. Instead of a few companies trying to offer end-to-end solutions, we'll see a network of entities focusing on different pieces of the puzzle.
Like some companies will specialize in data provision, others in data infrastructure, others in analysis and reporting. It will be more collaborative.
Exactly. And he thinks that specialization is going to lead to more innovation and a more efficient nature data market overall.
So a lot of exciting developments in the nature data world. What are his final thoughts on how all of this will evolve in the next few years?
He thinks remote sensing will continue to lead the way, with new satellites and technologies giving us even better data. But he also expects to see a push to leverage smartphones and things like the Internet of Things to collect data about nature that we can't see from space.
Like sensors tracking animal diversity or soil carbon, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And he thinks regulations will play a big role in shaping the market. As regulations like the EUDR and CSRD take hold, businesses are going to have to face those data gaps and improve their ability to measure their impact.
So regulation will be a driver of innovation.
Absolutely. And finally, he really emphasizes the importance of a science-led approach to nature data. He believes that scientific rigor and transparency are essential for building trust and making sure this market is credible.
It's not just about collecting data, it's about collecting it the right way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It needs to be grounded in solid science and support meaningful action for nature.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful look into the world of nature data. It's clear that technology is opening up new possibilities for understanding and managing our impact on nature, and it feels like we're just at the beginning of a much larger transformation.
I agree. And as the report highlights, all this data is only as valuable as the actions it inspires. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll be exploring some of the financial solutions that are helping to fund a more sustainable future.
From green bonds to biodiversity credits, we'll unpack the world of nature finance and see how businesses are using these tools to drive real change. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We just explored this fascinating world of nature data, but now we're shifting gears, diving into the realm of nature finance. It's all about turning those data-driven insights into real action, and that takes, well, capital. It does. This is where things get real, turning that knowledge into something tangible. You need the money to make it happen?
Exactly. We've talked about the challenges, the frameworks, the data, but at the end of the day, it comes down to financing the solutions. So paint the picture for us. What's the state of nature finance right now?
Well, the report presents a bit of a paradox. On one hand, there's a huge financing gap. Estimates suggest we need hundreds of billions, maybe even trillions of dollars annually to really protect and restore nature.
Trillions.
Yep.
That's a mind-boggling number. So where's all that funding going to come from? That's the million, or rather trillion-dollar question. Right now, public sources provide the bulk of the funding for nature, but private finance is lagging behind. We need to mobilize private capital if we're going to bridge that gap.
Public funding alone can't solve a problem this big. It's encouraging that the report highlights the growth and evolution of the nature finance ecosystem. It might be relatively young, but it seems like there's a lot of innovation happening.
Absolutely. The report showcases a whole range of financial solutions, from things like green bonds to market-based mechanisms like biodiversity credits. There's a real sense that finance can be this powerful force for good.
Let's unpack some of those solutions, starting with green bonds. They've become popular for funding climate-related projects, but how are they being used for nature?
Green bonds can be used to finance or refinance projects that have clear environmental benefits. That includes nature-related projects, things like sustainable agriculture, reforestation, green infrastructure, water conservation, you name it.
So a company could issue a green bond specifically to raise capital for a project that restores a degraded ecosystem or protects a critical habitat.
Exactly. And these bonds are attractive to investors who want their money to support sustainability.
It's a win-win. The company gets funding for a nature-positive project, and investors get to align their investments with their values and get a financial return.
Right. And beyond green bonds, there are also sustainability-linked bonds and loans. These link the cost of financing for a company to its performance on specific sustainability targets.
So a company might commit to reducing its water usage or its deforestation footprint. If they hit those targets, they get a lower interest rate on their loan.
That's the idea. It creates a financial incentive for companies to improve their sustainability performance.
It's like baking sustainability into the core of a company's financial strategy. Now, let's talk about those market-based mechanisms. We know about carbon credits and their role in climate action, but how do they connect to nature?
Nature-based carbon credits are becoming more and more important. These are credits generated by projects that either reduce greenhouse gas emissions by protecting or restoring ecosystems, or they remove carbon from the atmosphere, maybe through things like planting trees.
So a company could invest in protecting a forest from deforestation, preventing the release of all that stored carbon. Those avoided emissions become carbon credits the company can use to offset its own emissions.
That's one way to do it. Or they could invest in planting new trees, which capture carbon as they grow. Those removals can also be turned into carbon credits.
It's amazing how we can take these natural processes and integrate them into a market mechanism that incentivizes investment in nature.
And the great thing about nature-based carbon credits is that they have all these other benefits. They help mitigate climate change, support biodiversity, improve water quality, enhance ecosystem services. It's a really holistic approach.
It's about tackling multiple challenges at once. The report also talks about biodiversity credits, which is a relatively new concept. What are those all about?
Biodiversity credits are similar to carbon credits, but instead of focusing on carbon, they aim to quantify and value the benefits of protecting and restoring biodiversity.
So a project that restores a degraded habitat and increases species numbers could translate that improvement into biodiversity credits.
Exactly. And potentially, those credits could be bought and sold in a market, creating a financial incentive for companies to invest in protecting biodiversity.
It's still early days for biodiversity credits, but it has the potential to unlock a lot of funding for nature.
It does, but we have to acknowledge that there are challenges. Figuring out how to measure and value biodiversity is tricky. We need to make sure these markets are transparent and avoid any unintended negative consequences, like land grabbing.
It's about ensuring that these mechanisms are genuinely benefiting nature and local communities, not just driving profits.
Absolutely. The report also highlights other financial solutions, things like sustainable supply chain finance. This involves integrating sustainability metrics into supply chain finance programs.
So companies could offer better financing terms to suppliers who demonstrate sustainable practices, like reducing deforestation in their supply chains or minimizing water pollution.
Right. It's a way to use the power of procurement to drive positive change throughout a company's supply chain.
It's fascinating how all of these financial solutions are starting to connect, creating this web of incentives that can support a more sustainable future.
And the report doesn't stop there. It also delves into things like payments for ecosystem services, insurance and risk mitigation instruments, even corporate philanthropy as ways to support nature. There's a whole toolbox of options out there.
It sounds like companies have a lot of different tools at their disposal. The report also includes an interview with Bridget Fawcett, the managing director and head of sustainability and corporate transitions at Citi Investment Banking. What insights does she offer about the evolving role of finance in this space?
Well, she highlights some of the challenges companies face when it comes to incorporating nature risks into their financial decision-making.
And we've talked about how complex nature loss is. It's not as straightforward as measuring carbon emissions.
Exactly. Bridget Fawcett points out that there's no single metric that captures all nature-related risks. Plus, those risks are going to vary widely depending on the industry, the geography, the company's footprint.
It requires a much more nuanced and context-specific assessment.
It does, and she emphasizes the need for more agreement on things like taxonomy and standardized reporting frameworks to help companies navigate this complexity.
Frameworks like the TNFD and the CSRD are definitely steps in the right direction. They're helping to create that common language and those consistent metrics we need.
Absolutely. Bridget Fawcett also talks about some of the innovative solutions she's seeing companies develop to address nature loss. She sees a lot of opportunity in areas like food systems, nature-based carbon removals, and water conservation.
Those are all areas where the link between nature, business, and finance is really clear. What are some of the specific examples she mentions?
She highlights companies like Full Harvest, which connects farmers with buyers for surplus and imperfect produce, helping to reduce food waste. And then there are companies like Aurora Sustainable Lands, which are developing high-quality, nature-based carbon removal projects.
It's encouraging to see companies stepping up and coming up with solutions that benefit both nature and their bottom line.
Definitely. Bridget Fawcett also acknowledges the role of big corporations, companies like Walmart, in championing conservation efforts.
Their Acres for America program is a great example of a company using its resources and influence to support large-scale conservation.
It is. And on the financial side, Bridget Fawcett talks about how sustainable finance is evolving to support those corporate transitions related to nature.
We've seen the growth of green bonds and sustainability-linked bonds, but are there other notable developments?
She mentions the growth of private equity funds that are focused on sustainability, the emergence of innovative debt instruments like impact bonds, and the rapid growth of the nature-based carbon removal market.
It's great to see that diversification of financial solutions. It gives companies more options to support those transitions.
She also points out the important role of regional banks and specialty finance programs in driving innovation at a local level.
They often have a much better understanding of the local context and can tailor solutions to the specific needs of communities and ecosystems.
Right. But she also acknowledges that there are still challenges when it comes to scaling these solutions and making sure they're high quality and impactful. We need more standardized approaches.
It's about moving beyond those niche solutions and creating systemic change.
Exactly. And she highlights the potential of those biodiversity credits we talked about, which are still in their early stages, but hold a lot of promise for funding biodiversity conservation.
Definitely a market to watch. Now, shifting gears a bit, what does Bridget Fawcett see as the key things that need to happen to accelerate corporate action on nature? We've talked about the challenges and the solutions, but what will really make a difference?
She emphasizes three key enablers: integrated approaches, data and analytics, and strong governance.
Let's break those down, starting with integrated approaches. What does she mean by that?
She's talking about the need for companies to move beyond treating climate and nature as separate issues.
Right, we've talked about how interconnected these challenges are, how climate change is a major driver of nature loss, and how nature-based solutions can help us mitigate climate change.
Exactly. Bridget Fawcett argues for a more holistic approach, where companies recognize those synergies and the potential trade-offs between climate and nature when they're making decisions.
So it's about breaking down those silos and understanding that environmental sustainability requires a more comprehensive strategy.
Exactly. The second enabler she highlights is data and analytics.
And we just spent a good chunk of time exploring the nature data ecosystem. It's clear that data is essential for understanding and managing those risks.
It is. Bridget Fawcett stresses the need for robust data collection, standardized metrics, and sophisticated analytics to help companies assess their impact, track their progress, and make better decisions.
And she also acknowledges the rapid development of all the tools and technologies that are making it easier for companies to access and analyze that data.
She does. And the third enabler she talks about is strong governance.
What does that look like in practice?
It means embedding nature considerations into a company's governance structure. It means making sure that nature-related risks and opportunities are discussed at the board level and integrated into decision-making processes across the company.
So nature needs to be a top priority, not just an afterthought.
Exactly. Bridget Fawcett argues that once nature is a top-of-the-house priority, companies can develop more targeted and effective approaches that are tailored to their specific sectors and locations.
It's about leadership, commitment, and really integrating nature into the DNA of a business.
Absolutely. Those are the three key enablers Bridget Fawcett identifies as being crucial for accelerating corporate action on nature.
It's a powerful message. Holistic thinking, good data, and strong leadership. That's what we need to drive progress on this critical issue. Now, the report goes beyond just highlighting the challenges and opportunities. It actually offers some practical guidance for companies on how to take action.
It does. It explores best practices and delves into the concept of integrated environmental management, advocating for a more coordinated and holistic strategy that moves beyond addressing environmental issues in a piecemeal way.
There's a growing recognition that we need a more joined-up approach to tackling climate change and nature loss.
Definitely. And the report highlights the work of organizations like the SBTN, which we talked about earlier, which provides guidance for setting those integrated targets that address both climate and nature.
It's about finding solutions that deliver multiple benefits.
Exactly. The report also discusses the importance of clear sector-specific transition pathways, helping companies in different industries understand the specific actions they need to take to align with a nature-positive future.
And that's where those collaborations and initiatives led by organizations like the WBCSD, the WEF, and Business for Nature become so important.
They provide the frameworks, the guidance, the platforms for companies to work together and develop and implement those transition pathways.
It's about moving beyond individual action to collective action, realizing that if we want to transform entire industries, we need to work together.
Absolutely. Now, the report also highlights 5 key action areas for businesses that can deliver benefits across both climate and nature.
Let's explore those. What are these priority areas?
The report identifies deforestation-free supply chains, water stewardship, circular economy solutions, investments in nature-based solutions, and transforming agri-food systems as the key areas where companies can make a difference.
These are areas where there's a clear connection between business practices, environmental impact, and the potential for positive change.
Right. Let's start with deforestation-free supply chains. The report stresses that companies, regardless of their sector, need to assess their exposure to forest risk commodities in their supply chains and take steps to ensure their operations aren't contributing to deforestation.
This is especially important for industries that rely on commodities like palm oil, soy, timber, beef, all of those things that are often linked to deforestation.
Exactly. Companies can use tools like certification schemes, traceability systems, and supplier engagement programs to minimize their impact on forests.
It's about taking responsibility for the environmental impact of your entire supply chain, not just your own direct operations.
Right. Now, the second action area is water stewardship. The report highlights how important it is for businesses to manage water responsibly, especially as water stress becomes a bigger issue around the world.
It's becoming more and more urgent as climate change and overextraction of water resources take their toll.
Companies need to assess how much water they're using, identify opportunities to reduce their water use, and put strategies in place to minimize their impact on water resources.
That might involve things like investing in water-efficient technologies, reusing and recycling water, working with local communities to manage water sustainably.
Exactly. The third action area focuses on circular economy solutions. The report emphasizes the need for businesses to move away from that linear take-make-waste model and embrace a circular economy, where resources are kept in use for as long as possible.
It's a fundamental shift in thinking.
It is. It means designing products that are durable and recyclable, creating closed-loop systems for materials, and finding innovative ways to reuse and repurpose waste.
It's about rethinking the entire life cycle of a product.
Exactly. Now, the fourth action area is investments in nature-based solutions.
We talked about these earlier, but it's worth revisiting them in this context.
Definitely. Nature-based solutions are actions that protect, sustainably manage, and restore ecosystems to address societal challenges. Things like climate change, biodiversity loss, water security.
So protecting and restoring forests, wetlands, coastal ecosystems, all of those things that can help us sequester carbon, enhance biodiversity, and regulate water flows.
Exactly. The report highlights the multiple benefits of nature-based solutions and encourages companies to invest in these types of projects.
And there are lots of ways companies can get involved, from directly investing in conservation projects to supporting initiatives that promote sustainable land management practices.
Right. And finally, the last action area is transforming agri-food systems.
This is a big one, right? Agriculture is a major driver of environmental degradation, but there's also a lot of potential for positive change.
There is. The report emphasizes the need for a shift towards more sustainable and regenerative agricultural practices.
So things like reducing reliance on synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, adopting practices like agroforestry and crop diversification, and improving soil health.
Exactly. And it also involves addressing food waste and promoting more sustainable diets.
It's a complex challenge that requires change across the entire system, but it's one where businesses can really make a difference.
They can. The report highlights the emergence of innovative approaches like regenerative agriculture, which focuses on restoring the health of our soil and the overall function of ecosystems.
It's about moving away from practices that deplete natural resources and towards practices that regenerate and enhance them.
Exactly. These 5 action areas really provide a practical roadmap for companies that are looking for tangible ways to contribute to a more sustainable future.
They represent those key areas where business practices can have a big impact on both climate change and nature loss, and where there's a lot of opportunity for innovation and collaboration.
Right, and the report stresses that taking action in these areas isn't just good for the environment, it can also be good for business.
So it's not just about doing the right thing, it's also about smart business.
Exactly. Sustainable business practices can lead to cost savings, increased efficiency, reduced risks, a better brand reputation, and access to new markets.
A win-win for the planet and the bottom line. Now, the report also dives into what it means to be a leading company on nature.
Right. It's one thing to talk about taking action, but what does real leadership look like in this space?
That's a great question. What does the report highlight?
It outlines the characteristics of a leading company across several key dimensions, things like strategy, governance, impact assessment, target setting, and transparency.
So it's a pretty comprehensive assessment that looks at how a company is integrating those nature considerations into everything it does.
Exactly. And it emphasizes that a leading company on nature doesn't just comply with regulations and report on its impact.
It's about going above and beyond.
It is. It's about proactive leadership, a genuine commitment to achieving those nature-positive outcomes, and a willingness to push the boundaries of what's possible.
So setting ambitious targets, coming up with new solutions, working collaboratively to drive that system-wide change.
Right. It's a high bar, but it also paints a really inspiring vision of what businesses can achieve when they prioritize nature.
It does. Now, the report also acknowledges that becoming a leading company on nature is a journey.
It's not something that happens overnight. It takes time, effort, and a willingness to learn and adapt along the way.
So it's about taking those incremental steps and continuously striving to improve.
Exactly. And the report provides a framework for understanding the different stages of maturity for companies on their nature journey.
So companies can figure out where they stand and what steps they need to take to progress towards that leadership position.
It's a really helpful roadmap for companies that are committed to making a real difference for nature.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from data to finance, frameworks to best practices. But now, let's get down to brass tacks. What are companies actually doing to tackle this nature challenge? Are they walking the walk or just talking the talk?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The report takes a hard look at the current state of corporate action on nature. And honestly, while awareness is definitely growing, there's still a big gap between acknowledging the issue and taking those meaningful steps to make a difference.
So companies are waking up to the problem, but dragging their feet a bit when it comes to action.
You could say that. The report highlights a real acceleration in corporate awareness of nature-related risks over the past few years. Companies are starting to assess their impacts and dependencies, but it's still lagging behind what we're seeing with climate action.
It sounds like the message is getting through, but maybe not sinking in as quickly as we'd like.
Yeah.
What's holding companies back?
A few things, really. For one, nature loss is just inherently more complex than climate change. It's very location-specific. There's no single easy metric to measure progress like we have with CO2 for climate. And businesses are facing a whole web of interconnected issues, from deforestation to water use to biodiversity loss.
It's not as simple as just cutting emissions. It demands a more nuanced, multifaceted approach.
Exactly. And then there's a regulatory landscape, which is still evolving. Frameworks like the TNFD and regulations like the EU's CSRD are relatively new, and companies are still figuring out how to navigate them.
It's a learning curve for everyone. The report mentions a McKinsey study that found that only 25% of Fortune Global 500 companies have set targets for freshwater consumption, and a measly 5% have targets for biodiversity loss.
Pretty sobering statistics, especially when you compare that to the 83% of companies that have climate targets. It really underscores that nature hasn't quite reached that same level of priority for most businesses, at least not yet.
It's a bit discouraging, but are there any bright spots? Are we seeing any positive trends emerging?
There are, definitely. One encouraging sign is that more and more companies are incorporating discussions of nature-related goals and targets into their reporting. It shows that the awareness is starting to translate into concrete actions, even if it's not as widespread as we'd like to see.
So at least the conversation is shifting in the right direction.
Right. And we're also seeing a growing number of companies and financial institutions hiring experts in nature. They're building that internal capacity to really address these issues.
That's a good sign, investing in the expertise they need to make a difference.
Absolutely. And another positive trend is this growing focus on integrated environmental management.
We touched on that earlier, but what does integrated environmental management look like in practice? What are companies actually doing?
It's about moving away from those siloed approaches to environmental issues and embracing a more holistic, coordinated strategy. It's about recognizing that climate change, nature loss, pollution, these are all interconnected challenges.
So instead of having separate teams working on climate, water, biodiversity, you have a more integrated approach where those teams are collaborating and finding solutions that address multiple challenges at once.
Exactly. It's about understanding those connections and realizing that solutions in one area can often have positive ripple effects in others.
Makes perfect sense. And the report highlights the work of organizations like the TNFD and the SBTN, which are promoting this integrated approach.
Right. The TNFD provides that framework for disclosing nature-related risks and opportunities, while the SBTN gives guidance on setting those integrated targets that address both climate and nature. These frameworks are giving companies the tools they need to think holistically about their environmental impact.
It's about developing those win-win strategies that benefit both the business and the planet. Now, the report also goes beyond the high-level concepts and gets into the nitty-gritty of what companies can actually do. It highlights 5 key action areas that can deliver those co-benefits for both climate and nature.
It does. It identifies deforestation-free supply chains, water stewardship, circular economy solutions, investments in nature-based solutions, and transforming agri-food systems as those key areas where companies can make a difference.
Let's dig into those, starting with deforestation-free supply chains. This is critical, especially for companies that rely on those commodities that are often linked to deforestation.
Absolutely. The report stresses that companies need to move beyond those simple commitments to zero deforestation. They need to put concrete measures in place to make sure their supply chains aren't contributing to the problem.
So things like tracing the origins of their commodities, working with suppliers to adopt more sustainable practices, supporting initiatives that are protecting forests.
Right. It's about taking responsibility for the entire supply chain from start to finish. Now, moving on to water stewardship. With water scarcity becoming a bigger and bigger issue globally, companies need to step up their efforts to manage water responsibly.
It's a pressing issue, especially with climate change intensifying those water stresses.
It is. The report emphasizes that companies need to assess their water use, identify opportunities to reduce their consumption, and implement strategies to minimize their impact.
So things like investing in water-efficient technologies, reusing and recycling water, and working collaboratively with local communities to ensure that water resources are managed sustainably.
Exactly. And then there's the circular economy. The report really pushes companies to move away from that linear take-make waste model and embrace a circular economy where resources are kept in use for as long as possible.
It's about fundamentally changing how we think about production and consumption.
It is. It involves designing products that are durable and recyclable, creating those closed-loop systems for materials, and finding creative ways to reuse and repurpose waste.
It's about minimizing waste and reducing our reliance on those virgin resources. Now, the report also talks about investments in nature-based solutions.
Right, we've talked about the multiple benefits of nature-based solutions. The report encourages companies to invest in projects that are protecting, restoring, and sustainably managing ecosystems.
So supporting initiatives that are conserving forests, restoring wetlands, protecting coastal ecosystems, all those things that can provide a whole range of benefits, from carbon sequestration to biodiversity enhancement to water regulation.
Exactly. Nature-based solutions offer a really powerful way to tackle some of our biggest environmental challenges.
And they can also enhance business resilience and create new economic opportunities. It's a win-win. Now, the final action area the report highlights is transforming those agri-food systems.
This is a huge challenge because agriculture is such a major driver of environmental degradation, but it's also an area where there's massive potential for positive change.
Absolutely. The report emphasizes the need to transition towards more sustainable and regenerative agricultural practices.
So things like reducing our reliance on synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, promoting soil health, adopting practices like agroforestry and crop diversification, it's about working with nature, not against it.
And it also involves tackling food waste and promoting more sustainable diets. It's a system-wide shift that requires a lot of collaboration and innovation across the entire value chain.
It does, and the report highlights the emergence of really promising approaches like regenerative agriculture, which is all about restoring the health of our soil and the function of those ecosystems.
It's about moving away from those extractive practices that deplete natural resources and embracing practices that regenerate and enhance them.
Exactly. Now, beyond those 5 key action areas, the report also dives into this fascinating concept of nature tech.
Nature tech, that's intriguing. What exactly is that all about?
It's basically about harnessing technology to support nature-based solutions. It's about using technology to enable, accelerate, and scale up those solutions.
So using all the tools in our technological toolbox to help protect and restore nature.
Precisely. And it's a rapidly evolving field, attracting a lot of investment. Nature tech encompasses a really wide range of technologies, from things like satellite monitoring and remote sensing to environmental DNA analysis and artificial intelligence.
It's incredible how technology is being used to understand, manage, and restore our natural world. The report highlights 4 key areas where nature tech is already making a difference: deployment, measurement, reporting, and verification, or MRV, transparency, and connection.
It's a pretty comprehensive overview. Let's start with deployment. How is technology helping us to deploy nature-based solutions more effectively?
That's a great question. What's the report say?
Well, it talks about how nature tech is being used to develop tools that empower people on the ground, those practitioners like farmers, foresters, and conservationists, to implement those nature-based solutions more efficiently and effectively.
So things like precision agriculture techniques that optimize the use of inputs, drones that are being used for reforestation, software platforms that help manage conservation projects.
Exactly. Technology allows us to implement those solutions on a larger scale and with a higher level of precision. Now, the second area, MRV, is all about measuring the impact of those nature-based solutions, making sure they're actually delivering the intended benefits.
So making sure we're getting a return on our investment, both for nature and for the financial resources that are being put into these projects.
Right, and nature tech is playing a crucial role here. It's helping us develop those tools and platforms that streamline data collection, track progress, and verify those outcomes.
So technologies like remote sensing to monitor things like forest cover, sensors that track water quality, blockchain platforms that enhance transparency and accountability in supply chains.
Exactly. Robust MRV is essential for building trust and ensuring that those investments in nature-based solutions are yielding those tangible, measurable results.
It's about making sure that those efforts are actually making a difference. Now, what about transparency? How is technology helping to bring more transparency to the intersection of nature and business?
Well, technology is making it possible to trace those commodities and products through the entire supply chain. It's easier to see where materials are coming from and verify that they're being sourced sustainably.
This is particularly important for tackling those really challenging issues like deforestation, illegal fishing, human rights abuses in those complex global supply chains.
Absolutely. Technologies like blockchain, GPS tracking, and DNA analysis are making it much harder for companies to hide those unsustainable practices.
It's about shining a light on those practices and empowering consumers and investors to make more informed decisions about the products they buy and the companies they support.
Exactly. Now, the final area the report highlights is connection. How is technology connecting people and organizations in this effort to protect and restore nature?
It sounds like it's breaking down those traditional silos and fostering collaboration.
It is. Technology is being used to create these platforms that connect individuals, communities, organizations, and investors who are passionate about protecting and restoring nature.
So things like crowdfunding platforms that allow individuals to invest in conservation projects, citizen science apps that let people contribute data, online marketplaces that connect buyers and sellers of ecosystem services.
Exactly. Technology is lowering those barriers to entry and creating opportunities for new forms of collaboration and innovation.
It's a really exciting space to watch. It feels like we're just scratching the surface of what's possible.
We are. As technology continues to advance, we can expect to see even more innovative solutions to those interconnected challenges of climate change, nature loss, and sustainable development.
Well, this deep dive into the world of nature has been incredibly enlightening. We've explored the complexities of the challenge, the innovative solutions that are emerging, and the crucial role that businesses, investors, and individuals can play in creating a more sustainable future.
It's clear that nature is no longer just a side issue. It's a core business concern that demands our attention, our innovation, and our collaboration.
We hope this deep dive has inspired you to think differently about your own relationship with nature and recognize the role you can play in protecting and restoring our planet. Every action, no matter how small, makes a difference.
Absolutely. Together, we can create a future where both people and nature can thrive.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep taking action.